The history of deportation and return of the Crimean Tatars is unique, as they didn't receive the right to return and renew their autonomy in 1956, like most punished peoples. At the same time, they escaped the fate of other unrehabilitated peoples. They didn't invent a new homeland as did the Germans deported before and during the war from the Volga region, Ukraine and Crimea, only some of whom returned to the pre-war places of residence. Unlike the Koreans, who admit that they have become Russified, Crimean Tatars did not remain scattered all over the former Soviet republics. Instead, despite the ban, Crimean Tatars tried to return to their homeland during the Soviet era. According to Greta Yuling, we still lack a very clear understanding of the ways in which forced migrants in the former Soviet Union conceptualized their attachment to place and the implications of these conceptualizations for the debate concerning people, place, and identity. Peter Guttrow attributes this problem to the fact that the history of migration has only one direction of study and occasionally pays attention to the movement in opposite direction. In particular, he asks the question, how did Crimean Tatars returnees deal with homecoming? Stuart Hall, a British sociologist of Armenian descent who identified himself as a migrant, wrote in 1987 that migrants know that really, in the deep sense, she or he is never going back. Migration is a one-way trip. There is no home to go back to. At the same time, Hami Baba was compiling a volume which included Hall's article, Crimean Tatars came to the Red Square in Moscow demanding the organized return to their homeland. To answer the question, how Crimean Tatars preserved their connection to homeland and managed to return, I am going to rely on migration studies methodology. The deportation of Crimean Tatars started on May 18, 1944. Soviet authorities did not try to figure out who had been guilty of the collaboration during the 3 years occupation of Crimea. However, instead, they deported the entire Crimean Tatar population, even women, children, and elderly. Their final destination were Uzbekistan and labor camps in the Ural and the Volga district. The entire nation was put into the penal camps, so-called special settlements, without any right to leave it. During the first years of exile, there was a widespread belief that Crimean Tatars had been deported by mistake, so that they wouldn't be returned soon. In 1956, a decree of the Presidium of the Supreme Council of the USSR released Crimean Tatars from special settlements. However, they were not allowed to settle in the Crimean region. Thus, unlike other punished peoples, the Crimean Tatars were deprived of the right to restore autonomy and the opportunity to return to their homeland. In 1967, the decree was issued according to which the charges against Crimean Tatars were dropped, but Crimean Tatars were still not allowed to return to their homeland. However, it was this decree that provoked Crimean Tatars to relocate to Crimea. About 10,000 Crimean Tatars returned to their homeland between 1967 and 1978. The growing number of resettlements to Crimea provoked a strong reaction from the authorities. In 1978, the resolution of the Council of Ministers on the USSR legalized the first eviction of Crimean Tatars from Crimea. This act suspended the return process for almost 10 years. Such aggravation of the situation in Crimea led to the political persecution and caused several suicides, among them self-immolation of Musa Mahmud. With the start of perestroika, Crimean Tatars' migration to Crimea resumed in 1987. Under historical context and push-pull factors of migration, I am addressing difference between return before 1989 and repatriation after 1989. I argue that pull factors provoke the return process and push factors led to repatriation. Thus, if the return took place under the influence of nostalgia and a sense of belonging, which are pull factors, then repatriation is provoked by the so-called push factors, namely, several events that took place in 1989 and pushed out Crimean Tatars from Uzbekistan en masse. First of all, it was the Fergana event that Uzbeks persecuted Meskhetian Turks. Along with Meskhetian Turks, the Crimean Tatars who lived in the epicenter of the conflict became refugees. Moreover, Elvira, one of my informants, recalls that in 1989 there was a feeling that Crimean Tatars would be the next target of attack after Meskhetian Turks. Hence, Crimean Tatars families planned to return to Crimea regardless of whether they were affected by the Fergana events. Researcher Emil Pine called this feeling Fergana syndrome. At the end of 1989, two documents were adopted, which, although partially, met the requirements of the Crimean Tatars. On November 14th, the Supreme Council of the USSR declared its intention to restore the rights of repressed peoples by law. On November 28th, the Supreme Council approved the summary of the State Commission on the Problems of Crimean Tatars. The document recognized the right of the Crimean Tatars to return to their historical homeland and restore national integrity. Thus, the central government legitimized the right to return, which is one of the defining attributes of repatriation. According to statistics, in the late 80s, the Crimean Tatars population in Crimea significantly increased. Another sign of repatriation is organization. Resettlement after 1989 was a well-coordinated process in which the movement units were families and neighborhoods. Analysis of memories of deportation suggests that the loss of homeland has become an important component of the trauma of exile. The latter has affected the identity and the forging of the vision of the whole Crimea as a home. It was a traumatic loss of homeland that strengthened the exiles' connection with their homes. As Peter Gattro argues, displacement also entails a consideration of return journeys. Memories of deportation from the Crimea during the exile included memories of home, farewell to the homeland, and dreams of return. Thus, the idea of the mandatory return of Crimean Tatars has been ingrained in the deportation narratives since their emergence. Obviously, within the available research approaches, the category of return is tried to be explained in particular through an inseparable connection with the place, namely the home. The migration studies approach assumes that exile forms a complex system of narratives and practices based on the notion of a lost home. This system aims to either maintain contact with the homeland or return home. According to James Clifford, roots always precede roads. Migration researchers drawing on social constructivism pay attention to the process of reinventing the home by migrants, following the image created by them in exile. Home space is no longer just a physical category, but a combination of practices, ideas, and emotions. Ivana Feldman calls the homeland-related system of narratives what people remember and say, and practice what people do, a refrain. According to Feldman, the refrain, due to repetition and articulation, can reproduce the home in exile and maintain contact with the homeland. Indeed, in exile, the routine of past life in Crimea has become especially important. These peculiar practices of the homeland had the same effect as family narratives in spreading knowledge about the native land and forging the identity of the second generation of Crimean Tatars born in exile. According to my informants, Crimean practices were so deeply integrated into daily life that it seemed that there was no deportation. The set of practices which embodied previous experience played a role in preserving the home for those born in the Crimea and born identity for the second generation. For example, the Crimean Tatars were proud of the tradition of drinking coffee, which they considered to be peculiar to them. To prove it, they said that Uzbeks were unfamiliar with coffee and preferred tea instead. Crimea was a role model, an example of another life. While constructing an imagined homeland, Crimean Tatars looked for ordinary things in exile, resembling those they had seen and tasted in Crimea. For instance, Shefika remembers that her parents used to compare everything with Crimea, so they repeated all the time, everything was different in Crimea. Thus, homeland was a determined element for Crimean Tatar identity in exile. Initially, Crimea was perceived as their lost paradise or even promised land. Experiencing discrimination and accusation of treason, Crimean Tatars turned to the positive image of Crimean created by their parents as a source of their own identity, different from the one imposed on them by their surroundings. In the narratives of Crimean Tatars born in exile, an important place is given to the image of the lost homeland. Crimea was imagined as a place to return to. According to Juliana Hammer, the image of the homeland can cause a desire to return to where a person has never been. The image of a distant and fairy tale country was formed from the stories of adults and influenced by family narratives. Zira says that Crimea was for her like a magic country Susanbil from Uzbek fairy tales, which she used to read. Crimean Tatars born in exile learn about deportation and lost homeland primarily in the family circle. Thus, the extended Crimean Tatars families became memory communities in which knowledge about Crimea circulated. In the narratives of the second generation, there is an image of Crimea which was created for them by their parents, a fairy tale homeland where life flows harmoniously. The desire to return is rooted in this harmony. The emergence of the second generation of migrants' desire to return where they have never been, to an imaginary homeland, is the result of the image of the home formed by their parents. In exile, the older generation Crimean Tatars formed the image of a lost homeland as a place with incredible landscapes where there is plenty of everything. The second generation of Crimean Tatars, born in exile, adopted this image, rethinking it under the visual images of palm trees and cypresses, giving it a fairy tale mystery. Mark Israel proposes to look at exile as a social construct within which the invention of exile ideology takes place. Israel claims that there may be several ideologies, and one of them is, in fact, the ideology of return. In the case of the Crimean Tatars, the exile ideology made exile worthwhile and infused the desire to return to the homeland which emerged after the cancellation of the special settlement regime. The sources of the formation of the exile ideology were the narratives of the homeland and everyday practices that were preserved in the Crimean Tatars families. Crimean Tatars families as memory communities were places where memories of the lost homeland and deportation were preserved, reproduced, and spread. Collective recollection which took place within the family were important for forming knowledge about the past and the existence of a distant homeland for the second generation of Crimean Tatars born in exile. The emergence of the desire to return was also influenced by the image of Crimea as a desirable place to live, a place to return to. The tapas inevitability was formed. The idea of return as a process bound to take place despite all obstacles. For example, as a child, Edia heard from her father that he would definitely bring the family back home. Madavi al-Rashid describes the idea of return as an obsession. Crimean Tatars mention the return in their narratives in the categories of obsession as an idea that cannot be rejected. Leuman was 29 years old when he realized that his childhood memories in Crimea would not allow him to live normally. Image of Crimea, individual or inherited, was a calling to leave everything and return to Crimea illegally. Such an aspiration to return has a biological connotation because Crimean Tatars understood themselves as an essential part of a homeland, deeply rooted, and the exile was ruining this connection. Greta Yulin mentions that some members of the second generation had a metaphysical theory that molecules of the Crimean fruits their parents had eaten became a part of their bodies. Shefika calls the desire to return home a natural process. Sita Gya notes that the return was prescribed at the genetic level. Thus, the return must be considered as an idea or ideology arising among deported Crimean Tatars under the influence of hopes, dreams, or fantasies about the return. Mark Israel proposes considering exile as a social construct because exile is not a natural category for refugees and migrants. The researcher argues that the desire to return and later the decision to return are rooted in exile ideologies. The purpose of the exile ideology was to make sense of the community exile. In my opinion, in the case of the Crimean Tatars, the exile ideology was the desire to return to the homeland. That desire emerged after the cancellation of the special settlement regime, when hopes for the resettlement were not fulfilled. Thus, after 1956, there was a paradigm shift that I call overcoming the myth of return, because in the case of the Crimean Tatars, the myth of return was the idea of return as something that will happen by the authorities' view. Instead, the desire to return was reshaped as an idea, because the Crimean Tatars believed to be programmed to return to their homeland. Return is not an event, it's a long process of the journey to the restoration of normality, which was lost due to the deportation in 1944. The end of return is not always an arrival. Moreover, return includes an emplacement process. Journey to home, the so-called road to root, significantly influence reimagining the home and identity reforging. Emplacement also means inventing or reinventing home and homeland after returning because of the impossibility of returning to the past. If deportation, an unjust act of punishment, was seen as a violation of normalcy, The purpose of the return was to restore the harmony of life. Narratives of routine in the homeland and its rediscovery after return occupy an important place in the memories of Crimean Tatars. Based on Victor Turner's concept of liminality, namely the idea of the existence of a particular rise of transformation or transition from one state to another, Julian Harmer argues that return can change the individual's identity. After all, return is also emigration, or according to the narratives of the Crimean Tatars, another resettlement. Returning to the Crimea for the second generation of Crimean Tatars born in exile involves the first meeting and acquaintance with the homeland, awareness of the significant difference between the stories of parents about the dreamland and reality. Unfortunately for early returns, everything was not so picture perfect. A bitter taste of a promised land and everyday struggle for their rights made the Crimean Tatars face new challenges. Adia returned to Crimea with her parents in the 60s when she was a little girl, expecting something else, but not a dry steppe of the northern part of the peninsula. After returning home, the exiles faced the fact that the home they remembered or their parents told them about no longer exists. Returns can be accompanied by confusion and frustration caused by the difference between dream and reality. Shefika recalls that from the stories of her parents, Crimea was imagined as a promised land. Instead, nothing special, Simferopol just a large village. It should be noted that for those born in Crimea before deportation, expectations also did not correspond to reality. Roger Zetter argues that returning migrants believe that their home will be the same as before the eviction. Lutfi remembers painfully the orchards planted in Crimea before the deportation and cut down after the war. As mentioned earlier, the return involves reinventing the homeland, its reconstruction in the case of the first generation, those born in Crimea, and construction in the case of the second generation born in exile. Awareness of the significant difference between the stories of parents about the dreamland and reality in the case of the second generation, and between memories and reality in the case of those born in the Crimea before 1944, reinforces reinvention. The return of the Crimean Tatars was not an event. It was a long and time-consuming process which included adaptation to new living conditions and restoration of harmony through practices following the notion of life before deportation. However, for various reasons, the inability to return and live in a space associated with childhood memories or stories of parents determines the perception of the whole Crimea as a homeland. This process, which began during the eviction and ended with the return, illustrates the migration cycle. To conclude, the return should be viewed as an idea that arose among deported Crimean Tatars under the influence of collective memory, narrative of the past, and home-related practices. This idea often has the character of obsession, forcing the return despite the ban by Soviet authorities. According to my observations, the desire to return was formed in exile, influenced by the image of Crimea as a desirable place to live. The lost homeland was described in the categories of fabulousness, diversity, prosperity, and fertility, which echoes the feminine image of the motherland. Returning is not only the construction of the homeland and the invention of new homeland to replace the lost one, but also the formation of one's own identity on the way home. Returning as a journey does not necessarily end with the arrival. Moreover, it contains the so-called emplacement. The return of the Crimean Tatars was not an event, but rather a structure. The reverse migration of Crimean Tatars to their homeland is seen as a complex system imprinted with strategies for maintaining ties to Crimean exile, returning practices, and Soviet policies.